Good evening. Today we are going to start off with hypothesis testing. In our classes, we have already understood what is a hypothesis, and then we definitely have understood what are the concepts of errors, that is, the allowable error, which we term as the alpha, and how we actually term it as the level of significance, and from there how we can determine the confidence level. We even understood the basis of the type 2 errors, which is primarily given by beta, and we said that 1 minus beta is called to be the power of the test. Now, when we are talking about hypothesis testing, definitely this is a very important part of the inferential statistics. Any sort of hypothesis testing definitely follows this specific set of steps, and that is what we term as the process or procedure. So here today we are going to understand what are the steps in the process of hypothesis testing. So we'll be detailing on the process. Primarily, when we talk about hypothesis testing, we go in for the first step, step 1. It is actually a 7-step process, and we start off with the first step, step 1. Step 1 is all about the formulation of hypothesis. So it is the formulation of hypothesis which we term as the first step in the hypothesis testing. So formulation of hypothesis, which we have already discussed in our classes, formulation of hypothesis definitely comprises of two specific parts. One is finding out what will be the null hypothesis and finding out what will be the alternative hypothesis. Usually we'll write the alternative hypothesis first. Some books you'll find it being given as HA, and some books it is given as H1. In any of the format it is given, this is actually termed as the alternative hypothesis, and this is usually the one which we can conclude by seeing the sample result, the result in the sample, and a negation of that is what we say is the null hypothesis, which is written here. So it is given by H0 and it is termed as the null hypothesis. So two hypotheses are generated here. One is the alternative hypothesis, the other is the null hypothesis in this particular step. Once we have determined this, step 2 definitely goes to be to find out what will be the test statistic. So selecting the test statistic is actually the second step. Selecting the test statistic. Now this once again requires an introspection rather into the problem and trying to find out what is the sample size n, right? If sample size n is greater than 30, we can definitely say the test statistic is going to be the Z statistic. If sample size is less than 30, right, less than 30, then we say it is usually T statistic which is used, right? So here we are going to study about the means, comparison of means, or the comparison of proportions. In both cases, we either use the test statistic as Z or the test statistic as T, depending on the sample size, right? What is the sample size? Whether it is greater than equal to 30 or it is less than 30 exactly. So that is how we've determined the test statistic. One more thing which definitely falls out of these two steps is the type of test that is we are conducting here. Whether it is a one-tailed test or whether it is a two-tailed test. This once again is actually a fallout of the hypothesis and the test statistic that we have formulated in step 2. Now once we have selected the test statistic, we move on to the step 3. The step 3 is specifically deciding on the allowable error or alpha, the level of significance, right? It is the level of significance, or what we term in colloquial terms, it is the allowable error, particularly type 1 error. So it is the alpha which we decide here in step 3. So you decide on alpha, that is actually decided here. So that is your alpha that needs to be decided here. Step 4 specifically, once we have decided on the statistic and we have decided on alpha, we actually go ahead to find out the test statistic. The step 4 is actually calculating or computing the test statistic based on the sample data. Remember one thing here, whatever is the statistic, whether it is Z or whether it is T, it is always being given as whether it is Z statistic or the T statistic that you get, it has the standard formula of observed value, that is whether it's a mean or the proportion, minus the expected value divided by the standard error of that specific parameter, or specific statistic that we have actually picked up from there. Now, so Z or T, it is always observed minus expected by the standard error. So that will actually give you a value which we particularly term as the calculated value or the computed value, right? Step 5 specifically, which we talk about is you determine the critical value or the tabulated value of that specific statistic Z or T based on the alpha that you have actually decided here in the step 3, and based on whether it's a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test. So out of the step 2 and step 3, definitely you will find out what will be the value of the Z or the T statistic that you have picked up. So you determine the critical value, that is the tabulated value of that specific T statistic or Z statistic that you have actually picked up here based on the allowable error. So you determine the critical value, which we primarily represent as, if it's Z, it is given to be Z critical, or if it is say T, it is given as T critical, or sometimes even it is given as a tabulated value. So I write it as tab so that you get an understanding that this is the value that you are going to get from the table. Now step 6 is, once we have determined or calculated the actual Z statistic or T statistic value from the samples data, and we have determined the critical value from the tabulated value, we are going to compare the two. So we are going to compare the calculated value with the tabulated value. So we are going to go ahead with a comparison of the two values that we have got in our hands, right? Now, step 6 definitely is the comparison. And from here, we come to the step 7, which we actually say is the specific step where the decision making take place. Now, the decision making is actually based on a basic criteria that you are going to reject H0, that is the null hypothesis that you have formulated in step 1, if your calculated value, that is the mod value of the calculated value, is greater than the critical value. Please remember this. And you are going to accept H0 if calculated value is less than the critical value. This is actually the working procedure which we see. The moment you are rejecting H0, that means you are accepting H1, that is your alternative hypothesis is actually standing true. It is accepting H1. And the moment you are accepting H0, that means you are rejecting H1. So this is actually your decision area, which we say it is this decision phase which comes up here in the step 7. So once again, to sum up, which we have, it is a 7-step process. Step 1, formulation of hypothesis. Step 2, selecting the test statistic. Step 3 is deciding on alpha, the allowable error. Step 4, you compute the statistic value from the sample data. And then step 5, you determine the critical value from the table. You find out the value of the Z or the T statistic based on the specific value of alpha. And then you compare the calculated value with the tabulated value. And then in step 7, you go ahead with the decision making by comparison of the two values, whether to reject it or whether to accept it. Right? So this is the basic 7-step process, and then we get into the problems today.